Welcome to The General and the Journalist from The Times and The Sunday Times. We normally say this is a podcast about the old global order breaking down, but in the past few days, it's been torn apart. The stunning eruption of war between Israel and Iran shows just how volatile the world has become.
And here it really has. There is now a war over nuclear weapons between one power with them and one very close to getting them. And events are still moving very, very fast. All of which makes me very grateful to have an expert military eye alongside me right now. And that's you, Patrick, the general part of our equation, General Sir Patrick Sanders.
And you're the journalist half, Tom. Tom Newton-Dunn, helping us understand the politics of it all.
And what an extraordinary few days it's been. It's that Lenin quote again. I know we overuse it, but to say it one more time, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen.
Yeah, I mean, it really is hard to overstate the significance of what's happened over the last 5 days. And what Israel has done has been breathtakingly audacious and incredibly well executed. So today, we're going to focus on how this conflict will play out. How will it end?
So this episode, we got a bit of an extension, really, because it's not just the General of the Journalist, it's actually the General of the Journalist and the Grandee, if you like. Because George, I'm very pleased to say, is Lord Robertson. George Robertson, to his friends, former Secretary General of NATO, the only Secretary General to have ever declared an Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and of course a former Defence Secretary in a former Labour government. George, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be on.
You don't mind the General Journalist and Grandee. Can we work with that?
I don't like being called a Grandee at all. It sounds really horribly old. And I'm the same age as Donald Trump. So neither of us consider ourselves to be old.
No, but
that's one of the few things I've got in common with a Scottish mother, born in 1946, play golf, but I'm honest about my handicap.
Yeah. But you do look like a Grandee, George, and unlike the two of us, you have dressed up and we're looking a bit scruffy. So I apologise for not showing you the degree of respect that we should.
Well, generals should be properly dressed, and I'm dressed for the House of Lords. Otherwise, I would be as informal as you.
I'll take the bollocking. So, George, turning to Iran. Almost 600 people have been killed by strikes in Iran so far, 24 that we know of in Israel. I mean, how high are the stakes here? And have we seen anything this significant in the last 50 years?
I think the stakes are very high. I think we've seen things like this before, but we've had at least some knowledge about where it was going to go. The question arises here as to what is the strategic intent of the Israeli government. What is it that they actually want at the end of the day to achieve? In the short term, it's to stop Iran getting a nuclear weapon. But is it more than that? Is it regime change? Is it something more profound than that? And in that case, then questions arise over Israel's whole strategic objective in the region.
And that's precisely what we're going to get into in some detail. Let's just take a step back there for the moment and remind ourselves why now, if you like. Patrick, why has Israel attacked now?
So I think I'd point to three reasons. First of all, it's about the personality itself. Bibi Netanyahu, dealing with Iran's threat to Israel has been a single-minded goal of his for the last 40 years, particularly Iran's nuclear capabilities or the potential for it. And in the back of his mind, there will have been a concern, a fear that Witkoff's negotiations, which have been sidelining Israel, might lead to some success. And for Bibi, success in those negotiations might be almost as bad as failure in them. The second reason is about threat. And when we think about threat, it's a combination of do you have the capability and do you have the intent? Well, Iran clearly has the intent. But what Israel are now saying is that they're about to have the capability because they've accelerated the process of weaponization, according to the Israelis. And so they describe this as preemptive self-defense because the threat to Israel would be genuinely existential. And then the third reason behind this is there's an unbelievable window of opportunity for Israel. Iran's proxy network, the Houthis, Hamas and Hezbollah have been really degraded. The air defense network in Iran has been incredibly severely depleted since it was taken apart last October. They haven't rebuilt it. We've got a genuinely supportive President of the United States. And then he's got cover from the Board of Governors of the IAEA, who have castigated Iran for not sticking to the nuclear proliferation duty. And then the best excuse of all is that the 60 days that Trump gave Iran has run up. And they struck on day 61, and it looks like an incredible miscalculation by Iran to have run that clock down. So this has been, as far as Israel's concerned, a stunningly successful initial part of the military operation. They've been planning it for years. They've talked to me about it every time I've been over there. In 4 days, they've taken down the leadership of the IRGC. They've killed over 12 nuclear scientists. They've taken out a Houthi commander. They've bombed Natanz, Isfahan. They've achieved air superiority. They're winning for now. But as George says, it's not clear how that tactical success leads to their strategic goals.
George, what do you think of that? Especially the experience of maybe, look, politicians are politicians. They take advantage of events, and Benjamin Netanyahu is very good at that. But in terms of the immediacy of the threat to Israel, precisely how much of a capacity to develop, launch, and strike Israel with a nuclear device does Iran have? Now, we haven't seen the classified intelligence on this yet. You would have been party to that back in the day. But how close do you think Iran really were?
I'm not sure, and I don't think anybody is actually sure, because you've got to develop the technology, and then you've got to weaponize it before you actually then are able to do it. But the bomb under the table has always been the principle of Israel itself. They never have declared that they've got a nuclear weapons capability, but everybody assumes that they have, and I think Iran would like to get to that position as well. And as long as it's uncertain, then they've got the ability to use the nuclear coercion tool, which Putin has been exercising as well. But I think Patrick is right in the analysis about the opportunistic sort of view that was taken. Here's a chance to do it, and the President of the United States, he was wobbling around. He doesn't want to get involved in another war. He's got the Iraq war to sort of there to haunt him, but at the same time, he sees that Israel is maybe doing what some of his hawks would like. So we have to waken up every day to see what his Twitter account is going to tell us about the policy, which is very difficult to do. But the broader issue of the strategy is the thing that worries me. I'm not sure what the strategy is in terms of Gaza, because it seemed to me that they were creating a problem for the future by what they were doing against Hamas at that time. And the other strategic complication is, what do the big powers do? We know, because we're fixated on what Donald Trump is saying for America, but there are other people involved in this as well. Russia, China. Remember, China was the facilitator between the Saudi Arabians and the Israelis. They're engaged and involved. Turkey is next door. Must be worried about disruption inside Iran. So there is a broader landscape here that should concern every one of us.
In terms of Israel's stated objectives, and things are getting a bit mixed up now with talk of regime change, but in terms of the stated objective of this war, which is to end Iran's capacity to build, develop, and launch a nuclear weapon, can they do that alone?
Well, it would appear at the moment that they can do something about it. Block the tunnels into the underground caverns. But the Iranians have been planning for some time against the possibility of this attack. So they've built sort of layers of concrete and rock into that production facility that is deep underground. And we don't know whether Israeli intelligence or anybody's intelligence actually knows how to do it. But they will certainly be limiting the possibility of getting towards that weaponization as well. But, the ambition will still remain the same. But, minute by minute, by the time this podcast goes out, it could all be out of date. Something could have happened. Things can change.
We're going to do our very best
quickly
to try and keep ahead of that curve. But Patrick, on the military point, Israel has certain bunker buster bombs. It can do a certain amount of things. It can block tunnels, as George has said. But the truth of the matter is, they cannot do what they say they want to do alone, which is completely deprive Iran of their nuclear weapons program.
Yeah, and it's worth reminding ourselves about the steps it takes to build a nuclear weapon. So first of all, you've got to enrich the uranium. You then got to convert the uranium into metal so you can make a bomb. You've then got to create a warhead, then you've got to do a delivery system, and then you test it. And all of those things are distributed around Iran to the extent we don't know. But what we do know is that Israel has been getting after quite a lot of the different aspects of that system. So, for example, in bombing Isfahan, they've got after the bit that turns the uranium into metals. In going after Natanz, they've disrupted the centrifuges that enriches. So they're getting after that. But what we do know is that ultimately, if you don't get after Fordow and the second buried site near Natanz, then ultimately they won't achieve their goals. And Israeli air-delivered munitions, we think, cannot get into the depth that Fordow is, 80 meters down. And of course, the only weapon that can is one that the US have and would launch from B-2s. And that's the massive ordnance penetrator. And even that won't, with the first pass, look as if it'll begin to get down there. So the Israelis on their own can't do it from the air. That begs the question, is there a land option? That would be pretty bold.
That means helicoptering commandos to Fordow, to Natanz, and actually fighting your way into these extraordinary mountain complexes.
Which, as George says, have been incredibly well prepared, and the Iranians will have anticipated this. Now, by attacking the regime's leadership, by decapitating the military, that creates a degree of chaos which might make the sort of conditions for a special forces operation right, but it's still incredibly risky and difficult. So if the Israelis can't do it on their own, certainly from the air, then they're going to need the US to come in and help them.
So that's the fascinating picture here, isn't it, George? Because Israel would have known this from the start. They'd have known what their military capacity is, and then they could do some damage, block up some tunnels. But they would have known from the outset they would not be able to achieve their objectives alone, their own objectives for launching this war. So kind of begs the question, do you think Netanyahu always wanted Donald Trump to come in, bring American might into this fight? And that's been his plan all along. And we don't know. We're on the precipice at the moment, but that's precisely what be one thing that might happen next.
I think he probably did think that was a good idea, to bring the Americans into the region again, because the Americans, have basically retreated from the whole of the Middle East. Since they became self-sufficient in oil, they've basically retreated, and there was a bit of a vacuum, which is somewhere where the Chinese and the Russians have inserted themselves. But remember that the Iranian regime don't want the Americans into the region, and that they will actually act in a way that actually prevents it from happening, in so much as they can. They don't want America back in the region. They want to dominate the region.
What does that mean from Iran? What does that mean, though, in terms of what they would do or not do to try and persuade the US not to join?
Well, I think soak up some of the violence. To take a lot of this, to take the long game, take more punishment than most people would think was likely, and I think that and in a way that has displayed a bit of the restraint that we've seen. Up to now, people think, well, why have the Iranians not reacted more violently? They are a hugely bigger country, with an enormous amount of military effect themselves, but they don't want America back into this game, and they will play the situation, however much in the short term it damages them, in order to make sure that America doesn't come in. And I think you'll see a lot of threatening noises in the next few days, warning President Trump of the implications of being engaged in the region. Can I just say one other thing that strikes me? A lot of people said that if Israel attacked Iran in the way that they actually have done, the Iranians would not react against Israel, which is what they're doing to a certain extent now. They would go for other targets, soft targets, some of the other Gulf states that are close to America, and use that as the proxy.
Or the Straits of Hormuz, closing that 30-mile wide gap in the Iranian Gulf.
You can do that, so that would have been a suggestion that some of the military theoreticians had, but that hasn't happened, and I think it's because they're soaking up some of that violence in order to keep America out.
But the conditions in Iran have changed, haven't they? We made those projections when we thought Iran was very strong. they're now actually incredibly weak, and the last thing they want to do is to try and catalyze a coalition against them or have the US come in. I mean, we think about the US. We'll talk about what's going on in Washington, what's going on in Trump's head, if anyone knows the sort of decision making. But if for the Americans and if for President Trump, they share the same objective as the Israelis, which is you cannot have a nuclear-armed Iran. Should the US enter this conflict if the Israelis aren't able to finish the job themselves?
Well, that is the big question that will be posed day and daily to the President of the United States. And we can't tell how he is going to react. In normal circumstances, I think you would be able to make an assessment of what the advice was and how the president ultimately gets cornered by the evidence. But, the capriciousness of President Trump, from day to day, makes that very, very difficult to see. But I think he doesn't want to get engaged in another foreign war. And the moment you're into the Middle East oil, you are really up to the neck in the problems of the region. So that is one thing playing in his mind, and the other thing is, can the Americans be given enough help to do it on their own without them becoming involved? So you've got Donald Trump saying, I don't want to get further involved here, but I'll make a lot of noise in the process. And you've got the Ayatollah saying, we don't want America into the region. Can we soak up even more of the violence that is being meted against us in order to keep them out?
A lot changed overnight last Monday, didn't it, when Donald Trump suddenly announced he was flying home from the G7 summit in Canada a night early, and suddenly his rhetoric, which was really to try and calm all this down and say this is not America's fight, literally flipped. He ordered vast amounts of American air power, especially air-to-air refueling tankers, to fly from the US over to the UK and Europe, fighter jets too, and started tweeting some pretty bellicose things. Unconditional surrender, he demanded of Tehran and the like. The big question now, and I think you've sort of hinted what side of the fence you're on this already, George, is does Trump really want to do this? Is he being persuaded by the hawks in Washington, D.C., a lot of them in Congress, Republican hawks, Senator Lindsey Graham last night being the most prominent, to actually do this and get involved? Or was it just a great big Trump bluff again to threaten, to wave that big stick around, which is absolutely no intention of actually using when it comes to it?
We've seen a lot of that already. Ukraine was to be sorted in one day and the rest of it. I think his whole instinct is against getting involved. He wants that Nobel Peace Prize, and therefore he will use rhetoric in order to get the deal that other people tried to get and got a flawed agreement. But I just think all of his instincts are not to step across that line unless American interests directly are affected. I think in that case, then there would be an involvement. And that's essentially what they're saying about getting all of that equipment out into the region.
I was all those Trump rallies during the election campaign last year. I went to watch him. I covered the campaign, and campaign after campaign, he said, I'm the peacemaker. Wars don't happen on my watch. They didn't last time. Not quite factually true, but they won't happen this time. So it's against everything he campaigned for one thing. Interestingly, the war in the US, or the US joining the war, was very unpopular. So latest opinion poll, 60% of the entire US population are against the US joining Israel, only 16 for, 53% of Republicans against, only 23% for. So it doesn't add up politically for him. But yet, Patrick, you still think all the cards on the table, it would be the right thing for America to do right now.
Well, just carrying on the conversation, so a recent colleague of George's, Fiona Hill, who was part of the team that led the Strategic Defence Review, was talking the other day somewhere a lunch I was at, and she recalled that Trump's worldview had been formed in the 80s by a book he read called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, and in that, it's conditioned him to think about the dangers of overextending the US, of imperial overreach. And so I think running in the back of his mind will be an instinctive understanding of the limits of American power and the fact that he can't simultaneously deal with Russia, a crisis in the Middle East, potentially getting sucked in, And then, of course, the main focus is China and containing China and dealing with that threat. So I'm sort of in the same place in terms of trying to do a bit of Trumpology. But what is coming out very, very clearly from Israel is this conviction that the president will be true to his word, that he will not permit Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And the reason that the Israelis are acting as they are is because they clearly think that he's underwriting this. So it is hard to call, even though we may not agree.
And guess what? Tehran knows that Trump likes a hell of a good word game, but often that bluff he's not able to deliver on. He's got this nickname now, the Tacker president. Trump always chickens out. So maybe the Iranians think, we hear you threatening us with Armageddon, but we know you're not really going to go ahead and do it.
Well, we'll see. And he will get as close to making the threat real as he possibly can without actually stepping over the line. And therefore, the Ayatollahs have really got to make a judgment here as well. Mm-hmm. But there is a coincidence between an American president who doesn't want to get into the region up to the neck, and the Ayatollahs who don't want the Americans to come into the region, and an Israel that is determined that they will, and an American public opinion that by and large is opposed to America getting engaged in that. But we forget in that chessboard the fact that the Russians and the Chinese are watching carefully outside all of these moves, and they have been engaged in the region, and they've filled, to some extent, the gap that was left by the Americans who sort of basically exited their interests in the region, and they're players now. They are undoubtedly players. So in the chess game, they must be taken account of.
And that's just a really interesting element. Just as a brief tangent on this, China and Russia. So China and Russia are part of the four Axis powers, as some have called them. Patrick called them the Axis powers last year. So Iran's a big ally of China. China gets 13% of all its oil out of Iran. That's a hugely valuable energy supply for China. Russia takes huge amounts of Shahed drones off Iran for its war in Ukraine. Yet, oddly, both countries have been mute. Why do you think that is?
Because they're watching carefully what's going on. And
this is an ally they could just be about to lose, especially if the regime topples.
Allies outside of NATO are very mobile. They fluctuate, and they are not there other than opportunistically. There is there is a combination between Russia, China, North Korea, and Russia, and they're being gathered together. But they are unhappy bedfellows, but they are opportunistic and tactically operating. But I think in the Kremlin and in Beijing, they will be watching carefully what's going on, and they can't be discounted in terms of the outcome.
And of course, what hasn't happened yet is that there is no economic cost to this war. More broadly, the oil price has spiked, but it hasn't had the consequences that we thought it might. And China is so reliant on Iranian oil that could change their behavior. But at the moment, this is a war between Israel and Iran. They don't share a common border, so there are geographical limits on what can happen. If this becomes a multiplayer war, if the US get drawn in, if regional countries get drawn in, how does Iran respond? If the regime is under really acute pressure at some point in the next few weeks or months, what do you think the Iranians might do?
Well, that's a big question, and I don't know the answer to that. And they will be puzzling in Tehran. In a depleted leadership from the assassinations. They've got to work out what they're going to do. And far be it from me or you, to make projections or forecasts about what they're going to do. But there will be an element of desperation in it because the population is desperately trying to get out of Tehran, and with this punishing series of attacks on the city itself, never mind on the nuclear bases, they've got a serious dilemma on their hands.
Because there's this horrific scenario, isn't there? Worst case scenario that a cornered Iranian regime, they're already running out of ballistic missiles to throw at Israel's Iron Dome, we believe, because their attacks are getting less and less by the night. They do have an awful lot of enriched uranium, though. The IAEA discovered samples collected from the Fordow plant, that deepest one, deep inside the mountains, that they'd enriched uranium up to 83%. and that is a few percentage away from 90%, which you need for weapons grade. So they're actually very, very close to have enough weapons grade uranium. They may not be able to detonate it. They may not be able to launch it on a missile yet. We don't know. They might be able to. But you could still move that uranium around the place, that enriched uranium. It's probably happening right now. And that uranium could be used to build a dirty bomb, smuggle it onto the streets of Tel Aviv, and they could explode it. And that is a horrific scenario. But it's also entirely possible and credible now, isn't it?
No, you don't have to explode it. You just carry it and you release it. And, the concept of the dirty bomb has always been one that has worried me, really. Once you get to the nuclear weapons stage, there are protocols, there are sort of amazing sort of restrictions, both moral, physical, that are there. But below that level, the dirty bomb is the thing that they could do. And we must worry about that. And the Israelis must worry about that too.
Does that worry you now as a prospect?
Well, it does. It genuinely does. I think proliferation of nuclear weapons is now going to be the norm after what has happened to Ukraine, which gave up its nuclear weapons in return for paper guarantees that were worthless at the end of the day. Other countries are now going to go down that route, however expensive and difficult it actually is. But the concept of the dirty bomb, the sub-threshold problems and weapons worry me much more than all-out war.
Mm-hmm. So, if you like, Israel has started this now. It's almost like a ticking clock, isn't it? They've started this war. Iran does have a very dramatic last line of defense, if you like, which is some sort of dirty bomb or primitive device. It's almost like there's a charge now, isn't there, Patry, to rid Iran of all of that capacity, which America might or might not have to join. But do you see it as a ticking clock now?
We're only at the start of this war, if you like, and the Israelis will have planned for this for weeks. So we can't work out, we don't know how this is going to end other than what the objectives are. And for Israel and for the US, it's about making sure that there isn't a nuclear Iran. So, I sort of take both of those at their word. How you get there is the key question. But the thing I worry about most is the same as George. If you don't draw a line, a red line, a line in the sand on this, then you lead, and sure as eggs are eggs, you end up with nuclear proliferation across the region. Mm. And that is the worst of all worlds.
So look, let's talk about the essay question, if you like, put it crudely. How does this end? Because it does sort of seem to us at the moment, doesn't it, that there's an extraordinary array of potential scenarios now, from a pretty quick peace, ceasefire talks, kind of looks unlikely at the moment, all the way to that horrific scenario of some sort of nuclear confrontation that's just been talking about. I mean, it's an almost impossible question, George, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Where does this go and how does it end?
Well, I don't know, and nobody knows. But I think that there is a prospect that Iran does what it did once before, and to say that they will not go down the nuclear weapons road. They will abandon the whole program. After all, General Gaddafi, or Colonel Gaddafi, President Gaddafi, did that in Libya. It didn't end up well for him, but he gave up his nuclear capability, as a result of international pressure. So it may well be that the Ayatollahs will decide that regime protection is all important, and therefore they will do a better deal, a Trump-type deal, which will be very similar to the JPOA, which was the one Obama had and which Trump denigrated.
Pulled out of in 2018.
Yeah. But something like that has got the Trump stamp of approval on it. And so, thinking in the mind, if I was in Tehran, and it's always useful to sort of put yourself in the mind of the adversary, what will you do if you're cornered? You can retaliate, you do the dirty bomb sort of thing. Or you can just say, right, let's just, we are a powerful country, an important country. We don't need a nuclear weapon. Keep it under the table, and we'll sign up to something with somebody else, but the credit will go to President Trump, rather than bringing America back into the region which you want to avoid.
What do you think, Patrick?
I think I agree with George. I think the most likely outcome is that we end up with a deal that President Trump can say is a great deal on Truth Social, where the Iranians lie. And I think what this whole episode will have taught them is that accelerating towards breakout and developing a nuclear capability is the only way to assure their future.
I guess the big but is, if the Iranian regime does relinquish its entire nuclear weapons capacity, they may also think, well, that's the only thing we've got left as some sort of bargaining tool here. If we give that up, our regime is gone. But we're certainly on a fulcrum now. George, should we just step back for a moment here and kind of ask the question that we obsess about on this podcast every week, and quite rightly, which is, when you were NATO Secretary General, after your time as Defence Secretary, the early 2000s, it was almost the high watermark, you like, of peace. The Cold War dividend, Fukuyama declared the end of history. NATO was dominant. There was no threat to it anywhere in the world. And it was a very benign, kind of happy time, certainly if you lived in a NATO country. How on earth did we get from there to here? World chaos.
I think Vladimir Putin, who I got on well with, I met 9 times, and I stood beside him at the NATO-Russia summit 2002. Heard him saying, in Russian, but Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation state, and it will make its own decisions about peace and security. But over the years, he started to believe that he could recreate the respect, the admiration, maybe the fear that people had for the Soviet Union, and boiled up during the pandemic. Signs of weakness in the West, and we displayed plenty of that, suggested to him that he could recreate this new Russia in that way. So that was a starting point. The Chinese were beginning to build up their own capability, both diplomatically and strategically, with their eye on Taiwan, but on a much bigger, more long-term strategic objective of being the dominant economic and military power in the world. And then you got an acceptance that you could solve diplomatic issues by violent force. So Putin had this view that you could do that. Now, that is a reversion to previous centuries, where actually that's what we did. If you had a diplomatic problem with France, you invaded France.
But what about the charge that the West are equally guilty of that? One of the reasons that Western power may have declined is because of a loss of legitimacy. And there's no doubt that there's parts of the world look at what we did in Afghanistan and Iraq post 9/11 and see that as hypocrisy. Does that charge not equally apply to the West?
I think we bear some responsibility for what's happening. I doubt whether that's the totality of the issue, but certainly in the global South, who should be really worried about what Putin is doing in Ukraine, in terms of a big country taking over a smaller country next door. They should really be worried by it. But they certainly have in mind the idea that we have been practicing double standards as well. And we haven't really done enough in order to make the message clear to them that they have a dog in this particular fight, that borders are sacrosanct, especially for them. But so in that respect, we bear some, but not total responsibility. We could not have accounted for the megalomania of Vladimir Putin.
So, George, you've been there and done that. You were Secretary General. You've organised at least one of these leaders' summits before, herding 19 different egos. At the time, there were 19 members of NATO when you were Secretary General. There are now 32 now. What on earth is it like to try and keep 32 different big cat egos on the same page for 3 whole days in the same room together?
Not easy at all. It's almost a magician's trick to be able to do that. But there is one ego in particular that matters more than most. And actually, the effect of Donald Trump's capriciousness has united the rest of them.
So that obviously begs the key question. Donald Trump is going to be the centre of attention next week in The Hague, as he always is wherever he goes. Is the United States, under Donald Trump's presidency, 100% reliable NATO ally now?
I think so. I think we can count on the reliability of the United States of America.
Can we really? You just called the man capricious.
He can be as an individual, but remember the system is very much tied in to the alliance as a whole. The then Senator Rubio was the man who floated the resolution that said that, only the Congress can make decisions about NATO as a whole and the NATO alliance as a whole. So, the Congress, the country as a whole, very much in favor of that. So, I think the record of Donald Trump during the first administration was to question NATO, question the ability of the European and the non-US countries in NATO to defend themselves. And I think we're going to hear an awful lot more about that as well. But since then, the European and Canada have elevated their defence expenditure quite markedly.
In one word then, one word only please, if we triggered an Article 5, as you did during 9/11, Britain came under attack, or quite frankly any other NATO member, you were 100% confident that the US would answer that call and defend any NATO country?
Yes. You wanted one word.
I did want one word. Are you saying that because you think you have to say that, or do you genuinely believe that, if you don't mind me questioning?
I genuinely believe it. I think that the core of NATO, the self-defense principle, is so important. After all, I declared Article 5 after an attack on America.
We know it's important. The question is whether it's still alive.
Well, I believe it is alive. Whatever, the vagaries of words and of rhetoric, in order to get people to establish their own responsibilities to their own defense. NATO membership is a grand bargain for the United States of America. It gives them leadership in an alliance of 31 other countries. 31 allies sit round a table every week, listening to America and being led by America. So America has got a disproportionate influence because of the imbalance inside NATO that they would be very loath to give up. And I think even America under Donald Trump, the ultimate bargain maker, the ultimate tactician, I can see at the end of the day, this is hugely important to America and its defense.
Okay, that's reassuring, certainly to some. Will NATO continue in its current form, though? 32 countries under the same rules, all going the same direction, because we've seen this extraordinary splintering, certainly on the eastern flank, sort of Hungary, Slovenia, sometimes Italy and Spain as well, not wanting to do the same things as other countries on Ukraine. We had President Zelensky in the last few days accusing Hungary of spying on Ukrainian air defences, presumably to pass on that intelligence to Russia. Is the alliance fracturing?
But the great weakness of NATO is that it's 32 democracies, and the great strength of NATO is the fact that it is not like the Warsaw Pact, where somebody in the Kremlin makes a decision and everybody has to fall in line. So yeah, it's difficult to organise.
It'd be good if we could at least share the same enemy, wouldn't it?
Well, we do, and at the end of the day, they do. But individual countries will do it in their own way. I was very conscious of the fact you have 32 governments, 32 public opinions, so 32 sovereign independent nation states sitting around the table, but united by that commitment to Article 5. An attack on one country has to be seen as an attack on all countries. And when we did it, and remember, in 2001, America was attacked. First of all, we didn't know whether it was from outside the country or inside the country. But then it was a terrorist attack on New York and on Washington. And that was never what Article 5 was conceived for. And yet, despite the manifest complications, difficulties, apprehensions, worries about Iraq, everybody agreed to it. And in fact, the next day, everybody thought it was their idea. And I was quite content for that.
Let's talk about defence funding, because that's going to be a big issue at the summit, isn't it? So currently, the NATO target for all member states is to spend 2% of its GDP on its defence. Mark Rutte, who's got your job now, the new Secretary General, made it very clear he wants to push that up to 3.5%, a considerable increase in defence spending. A lot of European countries are getting there. Poland's already achieved it. The key is when, though, isn't it? Everyone will say 3.5% is a great idea, but there's a current fairly substantial debate raging on when the date should be that everyone agrees to hit 3.5%. What have you heard on where that's going, what that date might be?
I haven't heard anything, but it'll be into the future at some point. And what we want to do is to avoid kidology. and lip service being paid to targets that are not going to be achieved. It's 11 years since the Wales summit when the 2% was down there. And there are still major countries, Canada, Portugal, Spain, Italy, who are still under the 2% level. So talking about 3.5% has got to be more than lip service. It's got to be a determined objective that is based on both fear of what the alternatives are, but also reassurance and building a proper deterrence as well. And I worry more, I worry less about the figure than I do about what it buys. We as a country have an independent nuclear deterrent. It takes up 20% of the budget, but boy, oh, in the Kremlin, does it matter to them. It moves the dial inside there. But it means there's less on conventional defence to spend. But because we use it in a specific way that is valued, therefore in NATO we've got a bigger clout than we would normally have for that money. We have the position of deputy SACEUR as well. So, at the end of the day, Mr. Rutte has got to make sure that it's spent on readiness. It's got to be spent on equipment. It's not got to be spent on things that don't add to capabilities. That should be the measurement.
Can I tell you what I heard on the 3.5% target? I've heard that Mark Rutte very much wants to get it in place by 2030, everyone to get their defence spending up to 3.5% of GDP by then, if not 2032. But the consensus seems to be building, and Patrick and I have heard the same thing on this, seems to be that 2035 will be the date. Is that for you too late? 2035
is the date that we've worked our strategic defence review towards. It can be accelerated, it can be amplified before then, depending on circumstances. But
but is it too late?
It's not necessarily too late, because it depends on what it's spent on. It depends whether SACEUR gets what he wants in order to build the proper deterrence that will actually prevent anybody threatening the NATO countries as a whole. But I know how difficult it was to get our Chancellor of the Exchequer to go to 3%, in the next Parliament. And therefore, I can see the problems in all of these other countries, especially the ones who have not yet reached 2%, in getting to that. So the last thing you want is some nominal agreement at The Hague that pays lip service to increase money, but actually doesn't deliver what is required in terms of the capabilities that alone make deterrence credible.
George, you just mentioned the Strategic Defence Review. It's dominated your life for the last few months or so, and I just wanted to ask you a few questions about it. We covered it in the podcast a couple of weeks ago, having inhaled it overnight, as it were, and we thought it was a great piece of work for what it's worth. Admirably realistic and direct, and showed really bold ambition, but we weren't convinced that the government was addressing the very clear threats and imperative that you set out with the right degree of urgency. And I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. First of all, we've seen from Ukraine, and we're seeing in front of our eyes from Israel, just how transformative technology and the combination of artificial intelligence, data, sensors, and precision strike missiles is having on warfare. These are things that we could do very quickly. They're not things that take years to build. Your first step was to build a kill web. You set out the date of 2027 for that. And yet, we've seen from the government yesterday that they're only intending to spend up to 2.6% in this parliament. And we also know that most of the resources are being directed towards projects, necessary projects like AUKUS, like GCAP, like refreshing the nuclear enterprise, none of which really materializes until the 2030s or the 2040s. Are you concerned about the degree of urgency and addressing the short-term imperatives?
Yeah, yes, I am. It's conditional on the genuine commitment by the government and the British people. But I think it boils down to what the people want and what the people think are the priorities. I made it clear right at the beginning when we started this review that we had to turn public opinion. Last year we had a general election campaign and nobody mentioned defence. Then there was a Conservative Party leadership campaign where defence wasn't an issue. Now it is a huge issue. It's a really crucially important issue. But unless public opinion says they're willing to see the trade-off between other elements in the budget and what the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary believe are urgent requirements at the present moment, then nothing will move. We will be back into business as usual while our adversaries are learning the lessons of Ukraine and of Gaza and the wider world as a whole. So the Prime Minister has made it clear that they will fund the SDR, the Strategic Defence Review, and all the recommendations that are in it. The recommendations are 62 of them. They've said that they will fund them. They're a very clear commitment. So people who go around saying, oh, it's a very fine report, but where's the money? The commitment is there that the review will be funded. And depending on circumstance, and part of the circumstance is the British people saying, we want to pay the insurance premium. It is an insurance premium. That is what defence expenditure is. That's what you and your colleagues were before. The insurance policy that we pay in order to keep us safe. But the premium has now gone up. Pretty well every insurance policy, motor insurance, household insurance, has all gone up in the last 2 or 3 years. And so it has for national insurance and defence insurance as well. And I think we've got to make that argument. So the national conversation that we call for, and which the Prime Minister has said he's going to lead, is going to be critically important in order to get to the point that you're making.
What's the tone that conversation should take? I mean, clearly, one of the reasons we're doing this podcast is we want to contribute to that national conversation. We're very grateful to you for coming on. But it can't be people like us talking in an echo chamber. So how do we break outside of that? And what tone should we take? Should we be realistic about the threats, as I think you were in the SDR, or reassuring?
I think we have to worry people. You know, my major message when I go out is we are not safe. You know, we are not safe. The people of this country are not safe. The sub-threshold attacks on undersea cables, on pipelines, on our critical national infrastructure, the threat of cyber, all of that means that we're not safe. And then above the threshold, we can see what's happening in Ukraine, a horrifying invasion using the maximum of violence against a neighbouring state. And what the Defence Review does, and it's very, very readable. And for those who are watching these podcasts, read it, because it takes you through a narrative of worrying you at the beginning, reassuring you and telling you this is what the country needs to do in order to be safe. Rebuild deterrence, rebuild war readiness, and then you'll be safer. You pay that premium.
Just do it a bit faster.
Well, I hope we can do it faster, but the pressure has got to be on. Yeah. The pressure needs to be on the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The public opinion says this is the priority. It's not, unfortunately, the priority at the present moment.
Yeah.
And there we have the tensions between the general and the politician, if you like. I think you both want the same thing. You've just got to try and skin the cat in two different ways. It's fascinating. We'll definitely come back to this subject. Before we go there, let's return to Iran and bring this back to where we started, because the world has reacted, Britain has reacted very differently to France, to America, on what should happen next in Iran. And I mean, it's kind of quite hard to work out what the British government's position really is, apart from de-escalation. The Prime Minister doesn't seem to have a position on a regime change, for example. He wouldn't even answer that question. Emmanuel Macron, President of France, said it's a very bad idea. But we need to get off the fence, as we always try to do in this podcast. We need to, if you like, identify ourselves. Are we restrainers or hawks in terms of what should happen next, what the international community should do next? Who wants to go first?
Well, I would say restrainer. I'm a restrainer because we don't know how this could escalate and bring other bigger players in. So there needs to be a degree of restraint at the moment in order to allow some settlement to come out of it. You know, escalation or talking of regime change and talking about going to Tehran and buster bombs and all of that leads you in a direction of great danger and great peril. And therefore, I think there's got to be an element of restraint at the moment by the Israelis and by others as well in the region to try and see where the long-term solution might be.
Patrick, hawk or restrainer?
Well, off the back of all of my experience, normally I would be a restrainer. and I certainly wouldn't have started from where we are now. But the genie is out of the bottle. Israel has attacked Iran. The only thing that Iran can now do is to accelerate the nuclear breakout. So I'm a hawk, because I think the consequences of Iran getting a nuclear weapon, leading to proliferation around the region, leading to existential threats to Israel, and an added force to this axis of autocracies that George was describing earlier on, I think that the perils of that outweigh all of the disruption and violence that you would get from this becoming a regional conflict. So counter to all of my nature, on this issue, I'm a hawk.
And that just leaves me, and I've wrestled really hard over this. We were going to talk about this, we knew we were going to, and I can't get off the fence, which I just hate being, because I'm probably a hawk by instinct. But I just see the downsides are so enormous of a nuclear breakout, a dirty bomb in the streets of Tel Aviv, or frankly, regime change that goes so appallingly wrong, which may just happen. We've seen that in Iraq. We've seen that in Libya. So I guess I'm going to sit in the restrainer camp until or unless I can see a plan to properly execute an end game that resolves this thing peacefully, and then I'll put a leg back into Patrick's camp. But isn't that a perfect way for a journalist to prevaricate?
I'm not a hasty hawk. So I don't think anything needs to be done now. I think this can play through.
And I think I also worry about what Iran might do next. But I think it is unlikely that they're going to try and accelerate the nuclear weapons program. I think the risks and the dangers to them of doing that might suggest, if they want to keep America out of the region and they want long-term dominance in the region, I think some sort of deal might well be there. And I think that's therefore my restraint is not one that says I'm on the side of the Ayatollahs. No. It's because I think that there might be a better solution here.
This is an unbelievably difficult moment. These are unbelievably difficult questions. Yeah. But George, Lord Robertson, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been absolutely brilliant having your wisdom and your experience by our side to help us talk these sort of things through.
And thank you for listening. And we'll be back next week, Tom.
We will, when we'll be at the NATO summit in The Hague. And what a summit that's going to be shaping up to be. So if you like what you heard, do follow us wherever you're listening to us right now. And please do email us with your thoughts, your comments, your questions, generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk, generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. And I promise you we read every one of them. Until next week then, thanks so much for listening this far. And thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, George.